"Ma'am, I'm going to need you to gather your things and move to 28B. The flight attendant's tone carried that familiar edge of authority wrapped in politeness. "Your current seat is needed for weight distribution purposes." Sarah Mitchell looked up from her book, confusion flickering across her weathered face. She'd specifically chosen this window seat months ago, paid extra for it, needed it for reasons this young woman couldn't possibly understand. But when she tried to explain about her inner ear condition, about why she couldn't sit near the back of the aircraft, the attendant's smile never wavered. "If you refuse to cooperate, we'll have to consider removing you from the flight entirely." So Sarah stood, gathered her carry-on, and walked toward the back of the plane, each step a small surrender. She had no idea that 2 F-16 pilots were watching from 3 rows behind, or that in 18 minutes everything would change when they heard a single word. A call sign that would make them both rise to their feet in the middle of an aircraft, and render a salute that would leave the entire cabin in stunned silence. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." The afternoon sun blazed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Terminal B at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport, casting long shadows across the waiting area near Gate 17. Sarah Mitchell sat in the far corner, away from the crowd, her hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup that had long since grown cold. At 45, she carried herself with the quiet precision of someone who had once commanded respect in cockpits 30,000 feet above foreign soil. But today she looked like any other traveler, tired, anonymous, forgettable. Her auburn hair, streaked with premature silver, was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore jeans, comfortable walking shoes, and a navy blue blazer that had seen better days. The only hint of her past was a small silver pin on her lapel, wings spread wide, too small for most people to notice or recognize. Sarah preferred it that way. She had spent the last 7 years learning how to blend in, how to be ordinary, how to exist in a world where nobody knew that Phoenix had once been one of the most decorated F-16 pilots in the United States Air Force. The boarding announcement crackled over the intercom, breaking her from her thoughts. American Eagle Flight 1847 to Ronald Reagan Washington National, now boarding all passengers. Sarah checked her boarding pass one more time, seat 12F, window seat, just like she'd requested. She'd booked this specific seat 4 months ago when the invitation arrived in her mailbox, embossed letterhead from the Pentagon. Words that still made her heart race with a mixture of pride and anxiety. The Air Force Association was honoring her with their Lifetime Achievement Award for her service and her contributions to military aviation. After 7 years of civilian life, 7 years of teaching young pilots basic maneuvers at Desert Wings Flight Academy in Scottsdale, she was finally being recognized for the woman she used to be. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent years trying to forget Phoenix, trying to bury the nightmares and the medals and the memories of that last mission over Afghanistan. The one that ended with emergency sirens and a parachute deployment. And 3 weeks in a military hospital while doctors tried to repair the damage to her inner ear. The injury that ended her flying career and left her with a condition that made certain positions, certain movements, certain seats on airplanes, a careful negotiation between her body and the laws of physics. Sarah stood and joined the boarding line, her carry-on slung over her shoulder. Inside the bag were 3 things that mattered. The speech she'd written and rewritten a dozen times for tomorrow's ceremony. A photo of her squadron from Bagram Air Base, and a letter from her teenage son Jake that she'd been carrying for 2 months, but hadn't yet opened. He'd given it to her the day she told him about the award, said it was for when she was ready to remember who she really was. She wasn't sure she'd ever be ready for that conversation. The jetway was crowded and warm, passengers shuffling forward with the practiced patience of frequent travelers. Sarah moved slowly, partly because of the crowd and partly because she was never in a hurry anymore. When you'd spent 15 years flying aircraft that could break the sound barrier, the pace of civilian life felt like watching the world through thick glass. Everything slower, quieter, safer. Sometimes she missed the adrenaline so much it felt like drowning. She found her seat easily enough, 12F, right where it should be. Window seat with a decent view of the tarmac and enough legroom to keep her comfortable during the 4-hour flight to Virginia. More importantly, it was positioned in the aircraft where the motion would be minimal, where her damaged inner ear wouldn't turn the flight into 4 hours of nausea and vertigo. She'd learned this the hard way on too many business trips too. Many red-eye flights where she'd spent the journey gripping the armrests and counting the minutes until landing. Sarah stowed her bag in the overhead compartment and settled into her seat, pulling out the book she'd been reading, a biography of Amelia Earhart that seemed appropriate for the occasion. The cabin filled around her with the usual mix of business. Travelers, families, and tourists. The familiar choreography of people finding their places and settling in for the journey ahead. She didn't pay much attention to the other passengers. Didn't notice the 2 men in their 30s who boarded 10 minutes after her and took seats in row 9, both wearing civilian clothes, but carrying themselves with the unmistakable bearing of military pilots. The safety demonstration began, flight attendants moving through their practiced routine of oxygen masks and seat belts and emergency exits. Sarah half listened, her attention drifting to the window and the ground crew loading luggage into the cargo hold below. She thought about Jake, probably in his after-school program right now, working on the calculus homework he'd been struggling with. 17 years old and already talking about following in her footsteps, about the Air Force Academy and flight school and the possibility of flying fighters like his mother once had. The idea terrified her more than any combat mission ever had. That's when the disruption began. Jessica Torres, a flight attendant in her late 20s with perfectly styled dark hair and a smile that had been crafted by years of customer service training, appeared at Sarah's row. She carried a tablet and wore the expression of someone delivering news they knew wouldn't be well received but had been trained to present with unwavering professionalism. "Ma'am," she said, leaning slightly toward Sarah's seat. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'm going to need you to gather your things and move to seat 28B. There's been a weight distribution issue identified by our crew, and we need to relocate several passengers to balance the aircraft properly." Sarah looked up from her book, confusion flickering across her face. Weight distribution? She'd never heard of passengers being moved for that reason, not on a commercial flight like this. "I specifically requested this seat when I booked the flight," she said quietly. "I have a medical condition that requires me to sit in this part of the aircraft." Jessica's smile never wavered, but something in her eyes hardened slightly. "I understand your concern, ma'am, but this is a safety issue. The captain has requested that we move passengers as needed to ensure proper weight distribution. Seat 28B is available and will get you to your destination just the same." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. Seat 28B would be near the back of the aircraft, in the section where the motion was most pronounced, where her inner ear condition would turn the flight into a nightmare of dizziness and nausea. But she also knew the tone she was hearing, the polite but final authority that left no room for negotiation. She'd used it herself many times when dealing with difficult passengers during her years as a military transport pilot. "I understand. It's an inconvenience," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "but I really can't sit in that section of the plane. I have inner ear damage from my military service, and sitting in the back causes severe vertigo and motion sickness. I chose this seat specifically because of my medical needs." Jessica's expression shifted slightly. And Sarah caught a glimpse of something that might have been annoyance beneath the professional veneer. "Ma'am, I appreciate your service, but we have other passengers with medical needs as well, and this is the configuration that works best for everyone. If you're unable to cooperate with our seating requirements, we'll have to consider other options." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but clear. Other options meant being removed from the flight entirely. Sarah looked around the cabin and noticed that other passengers were beginning to watch the interaction, some with curiosity, others with the kind of uncomfortable attention that comes when a private conversation becomes public theater. She was becoming a problem, a disruption, the difficult passenger who was holding up the flight over a seat assignment. "What about upgrading me to first class?" Sarah asked, grasping for a solution that might work for everyone. "I'd be happy to. Pay the difference if there's an available seat in the front section." Jessica shook her head. "First class is completely full, and our premium economy section has been oversold. Seat 28B is the only option available." Sarah felt the familiar weight of defeat settling on her shoulders, the same feeling she'd carried. For 7 years, every time her condition reminded her of everything she'd lost. She looked out the window one more time, watching a ground crew member direct an aircraft toward a gate, and made her decision. "Fine," she said quietly. "I'll move." She closed her book and began gathering her things, movements careful and deliberate. As she stood, she caught Jessica's eye one more time. "For the record," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "my call sign was Phoenix. I flew combat missions over Afghanistan in an F-16 Fighting Falcon. I'm traveling to Washington to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Air Force Association. And I'm moving to that seat because I don't have any other choice, not because it's right." Jessica nodded briskly, already turning her attention to helping the next passenger. Sarah's words apparently making no impression whatsoever. Sarah pulled her carry-on from the overhead compartment and began the walk toward the back of the aircraft, each step feeling like a small betrayal of everything she'd once been. She didn't notice the 2 men in row 9 who had stopped their conversation mid-sentence when they heard her speak. She didn't see Major Tyler Brooks, an active-duty F-16 pilot, grab his seatmate's arm and whisper something urgent in his ear. She didn't see Captain Lisa Rodriguez, fresh from a deployment at Ramstein Air Base, pull out her phone and start typing frantically. And she definitely didn't see the look that passed between them, a look of recognition and disbelief in something. That might have been anger. Sarah found seat 28B exactly where she'd expected it to be, in the middle section near the back galleys, wedged between a college student wearing noise-canceling headphones and a businessman who was already elbowing for armrest space. The seat was narrow, cramped, and positioned exactly where the aircraft's motion would be most pronounced during flight. She lowered herself carefully, stowed her bag under the seat in front of her, and closed her eyes, already feeling the first hints of the nausea that would plague her for the next 4 hours. The college student on her left was absorbed in a movie on his tablet, completely unaware of the woman beside him. The businessman on her right was typing aggressively on his laptop, his elbows claiming both armrests and part of Sarah's seat space. Neither acknowledged her presence, and she was grateful for their indifference. She'd become expert at being invisible, at occupying space without drawing attention, at existing in the margins where nobody asked questions about who she used to be. But 3 rows ahead and across the aisle, Dr. Amanda Chun was watching everything with the trained eye of someone who had spent her career observing human behavior and recognizing injustice when she saw it. A clinical psychologist specializing in military trauma, Amanda had heard every word of the conversation between Sarah and the flight attendant. She'd also noticed the careful way Sarah moved, the subtle signs of someone managing a chronic condition, and the dignity with which she'd handled what was clearly an unfair situation. Amanda pulled out her phone and opened her contacts, scrolling, until she found the number for her colleague at American Airlines corporate headquarters. She'd done consulting work for the airline's Employee Assistance Program, helping flight crews deal with the psychological challenges of their high stress jobs. She'd built relationships and earned favors, and now seemed like the right time to call one in. Her message was brief but pointed. Passenger Sarah Mitchell, former Air Force pilot, moved from medically necessary seat 12F to 28B on Flight A, 1847. Claims inner ear condition requires front seating. Flight attendant Jessica Torres cited weight. Distribution, recommend immediate review. Passenger mentioned call sign Phoenix and military service record. She hit send and settled back in her seat, watching Sarah's profile 3 rows behind her. The woman sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, eyes closed, but Amanda could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she held her head. To minimize the motion she was already feeling as passengers continued boarding around them. In row 9, Tyler Brooks and Lisa Rodriguez were having a whispered conversation that was growing more animated by the minute. Phoenix, Tyler kept repeating. Are you absolutely sure? Lisa nodded emphatically. I've read every after-action report from that deployment. Captain Sarah Mitchell, call sign Phoenix, 421st Fighter Squadron. She was a legend, Tyler. 3 confirmed air-to-air kills, Distinguished Flying Cross, Purple Heart for that ejection over Kandahar. She saved an entire convoy when she took out those surface-to-air missile sites. Tyler shook his head in disbelief. And they just moved her to the back of the plane like she was nobody special. Lisa's jaw was set in the expression Tyler had learned to recognize as her combat face, the look she wore when she was preparing to engage an enemy target. This isn't over, she said quietly. Not by a long shot. The cabin door closed with its familiar thunk, and the aircraft began its slow push back from the gate. Sarah kept her eyes closed and tried to focus on her breathing, a technique she'd learned during her recovery that helped manage both the physical symptoms of her condition and the anxiety that often accompanied them. She thought about Jake, about the award ceremony tomorrow, about the speech she'd practiced in front of her bathroom mirror until she could recite it without her voice shaking. The taxi to the runway took 15 minutes, and Sarah felt every turn, every acceleration, every subtle shift in the aircraft's attitude as they maneuvered through the busy airport traffic. Her inner ear was already sending confused signals to her brain, the damaged vestibular system struggling to process the motion and orientation changes. By the time they reached the runway, she was gripping the armrests and counting her breaths, trying to manage the growing nausea through sheer force of will. The engine spooled up for takeoff, and Sarah pressed her head back against the seat, eyes still closed, focusing on a mental image of the horizon to help her brain process the acceleration. The aircraft lifted off smoothly, climbing into the Arizona sky, but for Sarah, it felt like being inside a washing machine. The motion was amplified in the back of the aircraft. Every slight adjustment by the pilots translated into a roller coaster sensation that made her stomach lurch and her vision blur. She'd endured worse, much worse, but this felt different. This felt like punishment, like the universe's way of reminding her that she no longer belonged in aircraft, that her flying days were over and she needed to accept her place on the ground with all the other ordinary people who didn't understand what it meant to dance with death at 30,000 feet. But in the cockpit, Captain Robert Harrison was reviewing an unusual message that had just appeared on his communication system. A corporate priority flag from airline headquarters marked urgent, regarding passenger accommodations and a potential service recovery situation. The message included a name, Sarah Mitchell, and a brief note about military service and medical accommodation requirements. Bob frowned and handed the message to his co-pilot, Lieutenant Commander Mike Stevens. You recognize that name? Bob asked. Mike read the message twice, his expression changing as he processed the information. Phoenix, he said quietly. Captain. Sarah Mitchell, call sign Phoenix. Bob, This woman is a legend. She was one of the best fighter pilots we ever had." Bob's expression hardened. Former Navy himself, he understood the bond between military aviators and the respect they owed each other regardless of service branch. He'd heard stories about Phoenix, about missions flown and lives saved, and a career cut short by injury sustained. In combat, the idea that she was sitting in an inadequate seat because of a questionable crew decision made his blood pressure rise. "Mike," he said, his voice carrying the authority of command, "contact the cabin crew. I want to know exactly what happened and why a decorated combat veteran is sitting in 28B when she specifically requested forward seating for medical reasons." Mike nodded and reached for the intercom, but Bob held up a hand. "Actually," he said, standing up from his seat and adjusting his uniform jacket, "let me handle this personally. Take the controls." Mike looked surprised but complied, sliding into the captain's seat as Bob unlocked the cockpit door and stepped into the narrow corridor behind the flight deck. He'd been flying commercial aircraft for 12 years since leaving the Navy, and he'd learned that sometimes leadership meant more than just flying the plane from point A to point B. Sometimes it meant standing up for what was right, even when it was inconvenient or uncomfortable or contrary to standard procedures. He walked through the first-class cabin, past passengers settling in with their complimentary drinks and extra legroom, past the premium economy section where business travelers typed on laptops and dozed in their slightly larger seats. He continued into the main cabin, past row after row of passengers, until he reached the back section where the aircraft narrowed and the seats grew more cramped and the engine noise was loudest. Row 28. Seat B. The woman sitting there had her eyes closed and her hands folded tightly in her lap, but Bob could see the tension in her posture, the careful way she held her head, the shallow breathing of someone fighting motion sickness. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe mid-40s, with graying hair and laugh lines around her eyes that spoke of a life lived fully despite whatever challenges she'd faced. He'd found Phoenix. Bob adjusted his captain's stripes and prepared to do something he'd never done in 12 years of commercial flying. He was about to apologize to a passenger on behalf of his crew, his airline, and every person who had forgotten that the woman in seat 28B had once put her life on the line, so they could sleep safely in their beds at night. What happened next would be talked about in aviation circles for years to come, shared in pilot lounges and training seminars as an example of leadership and respect and the bonds that connect those who have chosen to serve. But for Sarah Mitchell, sitting in that cramped seat with her eyes closed and her dignity hanging by a thread, it would be something even more important. It would be the moment she remembered who she really was. Captain Robert Harrison had walked through hundreds of aircraft cabins during his career, but he'd never approached a passenger with the mixture of respect and regret that filled his chest. As he made his way toward row 28, the woman sitting in seat B looked smaller than he'd imagined, more fragile somehow, though he suspected that impression came from seeing her in distress rather than any actual weakness on her part. Her breathing was controlled but shallow, the practiced rhythm of someone who had learned to manage pain through sheer discipline. Sarah sensed someone standing beside her seat before she opened her eyes. The cologne was different from the passengers. Around her, more professional, and the presence felt official in a way that made her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. When she looked up, she found herself staring at a man in his early 50s, wearing the 4 gold stripes of an airline. Captain. His gray hair was perfectly trimmed, his uniform immaculate, and his expression carried the kind of authority that could only come from years of command responsibility. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that the surrounding passengers couldn't hear, "I'm Captain Harrison. I understand there may have been some confusion regarding your seat assignment." Sarah blinked in surprise. She'd been flying commercial aircraft for 7 years since leaving the Air Force, and she'd never had a captain approach her personally about anything, let alone a seating issue. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice hoarse from the motion sickness she was already fighting. "I don't understand." Captain Harrison glanced around the cabin, noting the curious looks from nearby passengers, then made a decision that would later be cited in customer service training manuals across the aviation industry. "Ma'am, would you be willing to speak with me privately for a moment? There's a galley area where we can talk without disturbing other passengers." Sarah's confusion deepened, but she nodded and began the careful process of extracting herself from the cramped middle seat. The businessman beside her huffed with annoyance as she gathered her things, making no effort to move his laptop or give her space to maneuver. Captain Harrison noticed the man's rudeness and filed it away for later consideration, but his immediate focus remained on Sarah as she stood unsteadily and followed him toward the rear galley. The galley area was small and crowded with service equipment, but it offered enough privacy for a quiet conversation. Captain Harrison waited until Sarah was steady on her feet before speaking, and when he did, his voice carried a tone she hadn't heard directed at her in years. The tone of one military professional addressing another with full recognition and respect. "Captain Mitchell," he said, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Very few people outside her immediate family knew her military rank, and she'd certainly never shared it with anyone on this flight. "I owe you an apology on behalf of this crew and this airline. What happened with your seat assignment was wrong, and I'm here to make it right." Sarah stared at him, speechless. "How do you know who I am?" she finally managed. Captain Harrison smiled, the first genuine expression she'd seen from any crew member since boarding. "I served 23 years in the Navy before joining the American Eagle. When corporate headquarters sends me a priority message about a decorated Air Force pilot being mistreated on my aircraft, I take notice. Especially when that pilot happens to be Phoenix." The call sign hit Sarah like a physical blow. She hadn't heard it spoken aloud in over 2 years, not since the last reunion with her squadron mates. Phoenix belonged to another life, another version of herself that she'd spent years trying to leave behind. Hearing it now, in this cramped galley at 30,000 feet, brought back a flood of memories she'd worked hard to suppress. Captain Harrison saw the emotions playing across her face and softened his approach. "Ma'am, I don't know the details of your service record, but I know enough to understand that someone with your background deserves better treatment than what you received today. I also understand that you have medical requirements that weren't properly accommodated." Sarah found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "I have inner ear damage from an ejection seat activation. Sitting in the back of the aircraft causes severe vertigo and nausea. I specifically booked seat 12F because I needed to be in the forward section." Captain Harrison nodded grimly. "I'm aware of the incident that ended your flying career. Emergency ejection over Kandahar while providing close air support for a convoy under fire. Purple Heart recipient, if I'm not mistaken." Sarah's eyes widened. "How could you possibly know that?" "Let's just say the military aviation community is smaller than most people realize, and good pilots are remembered, especially ones who risk their lives to save others." The conversation was interrupted by Jessica Torres, who appeared at the galley entrance looking flustered and defensive. "Captain Harrison," she said, her professional smile strained. "Is there a problem with the passenger accommodations?" Captain Harrison turned to face her, and Sarah noticed immediately that his demeanor shifted. The warmth and respect he'd shown her was replaced by the cool authority of a commanding officer, addressing a subordinate who had made a serious error in judgment. "Miss Torres," he said evenly, "I understand you relocated Captain Mitchell from her assigned seat due to weight distribution concerns. Can you explain the specific calculations that required this passenger to be moved rather than others?" Jessica's smile faltered slightly. "Sir, we had multiple passengers who needed to be relocated, and seat 28B was the best available option for Captain Mitchell's travel needs." Captain Harrison's expression remained neutral, But Sarah could sense the steel beneath his calm exterior. "I see. And were you made aware that Captain Mitchell is a former military pilot with a service-connected medical condition that requires forward seating?" Jessica glanced nervously between the captain and Sarah. She mentioned military service. "Sir, but passengers often make claims about medical needs that aren't properly documented. We have to balance individual requests with overall flight safety and passenger accommodation requirements." Captain Harrison was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could practically see him processing the implications of what he'd just heard. When he spoke again, his voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made it clear the conversation was over. "Miss Torres, I want you to personally escort Captain Mitchell to seat 1A. If that seat is occupied, you will politely ask the current passenger to voluntarily relocate to another first-class seat. If no first-class seats are available, you will offer the passenger a full refund and meal vouchers for their inconvenience." Jessica's mouth opened slightly. "Captain, first class is completely sold out, and the passenger in 1A paid full fare for that seat. Company policy requires that we honor confirmed reservations unless there's a safety emergency." Captain Harrison's smile was thin and cold. "Miss Torres, I'm the captain of this aircraft, and I'm telling you that accommodating a decorated combat veteran who was wrongfully displaced from her medically necessary seat is a safety emergency. If the current passenger in 1A is unwilling to voluntarily relocate, inform them that the captain is personally requesting the seat change to honor a war hero." The silence in the galley stretched uncomfortably as Jessica processed the direct order from her captain. Sarah felt a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment, touched by Captain Harrison's intervention, but uncomfortable with the attention and the disruption it was causing. "Captain," she said quietly, "I don't want to cause problems for other passengers. I can manage in 28B for the rest of the flight." Captain Harrison turned back to her, and his expression softened again. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you shouldn't have to manage. You served your country with distinction, you were injured in the line of duty, and you booked appropriate accommodations for your medical needs. The fact that our crew failed to honor those accommodations is our problem to solve, not yours to endure." He looked back at Jessica, who was still standing frozen in the galley entrance. "Miss Torres, you have your instructions. Please carry them out immediately." Jessica nodded reluctantly and turned to leave, but Captain Harrison's voice stopped her. "And Ms. Torres? When you're finished with the seat relocation, I'd like you to report to the flight deck. We need to discuss proper procedures for handling passengers with documented medical needs and military service records." After Jessica disappeared into the main cabin, Captain Harrison turned back to Sarah with an expression that mixed professional authority with personal respect. "Captain Mitchell, I want you to know that what happened today doesn't represent the values of this airline or the respect we have for veterans. You've earned better treatment than this, and I'm going to make sure you receive it." Sarah felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, an emotional response she hadn't experienced in years. She'd grown accustomed to being overlooked, to having her service record dismissed as irrelevant ancient history, to navigating a civilian world that had little understanding of or patience for her military background. Captain Harrison's recognition of her service and his determination to correct the injustice felt like a gift she hadn't known she needed. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I haven't been called captain in a long time." "Well, you've earned the right to be called captain for the rest of your life, and anyone who doesn't recognize that is missing something important about honor and respect." They stood in the galley for another moment, two former military officers who understood the weight of service and sacrifice in ways that most civilians never would. Then Captain Harrison checked his watch and straightened his uniform jacket. "I need to get back to the flight deck, but I want to make sure you're properly settled in your new seat before I go. Will you allow me to escort you to first class?" Sarah nodded, still processing the rapid turn of events. 20 minutes ago, she'd been resigned to 4 hours of motion sickness and discomfort, forgotten and dismissed by airline staff who saw her as nothing more than a difficult passenger. Now she was being personally escorted to first class by the aircraft captain, treated with the kind of respect she hadn't experienced since her military retirement. They walked together through the main cabin, past rows of passengers who were beginning to take notice of the unusual activity. Sarah was acutely aware of the curious glances and whispered conversations that followed their progress through the aircraft. She'd spent years learning to be invisible, and the sudden attention felt uncomfortable and exposing. But as they passed row 9, something unexpected happened. Major Tyler Brooks, who had been watching the drama unfold from his aisle seat, stood up as they approached. His movement was sharp and deliberate, the kind of response that came from military training and years of discipline. Captain Lisa Rodriguez, seated beside him, immediately followed suit. "Captain Mitchell," Tyler said, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin. His tone was formal, respectful, laden with recognition that made several nearby passengers turn in their seats. "Ma'am, I'm Major Brooks, 56th Fighter Wing out of Luke Air Force Base. This is Captain Rodriguez, 86th Airlift Wing, Ramstein." Sarah stopped walking, confusion and recognition warring across her face. The two pilots stood at attention in the narrow aisle, their civilian clothes unable to disguise their military bearing. Other passengers were beginning to stare openly, now sensing that something significant was happening, but not understanding what. Tyler continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Ma'am, we've both studied your service record. Operation Enduring Freedom, 421st Fighter Squadron, call sign Phoenix. Your air-to-ground missions over Kandahar saved countless American lives, including numbers of my own unit during my first deployment." Sarah felt the aircraft cabin spinning around her, though she knew it was her damaged inner ear responding to the emotional shock rather than any physical motion. She'd lived for 7 years with the assumption that her military service was ancient history, irrelevant to her civilian life, known only to a small circle of former squadron mates and family members. The idea that these young pilots knew her record, had studied her missions, saw her as something more than a forgotten retiree was overwhelming. Lisa stepped forward slightly, her voice joining Tyler's in a moment that would later be captured on cell phone videos and shared across social media platforms worldwide. "Ma'am, we understand you're traveling to Washington to receive recognition for your service. It's an honor that's long overdue, and it's an honor to share this flight with you." Then, in a gesture that silenced the entire section of the aircraft, both pilots raised their right hands in crisp, formal salutes. The movement was precise, military perfect, executed with the kind of respect normally reserved for flag ceremonies and military funerals. Around them, conversation stopped mid-sentence as passengers realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Sarah stood frozen in the aisle, overwhelmed by emotions she'd spent years keeping buried. The salute was more than a gesture of respect. It was recognition of everything she'd sacrificed, everything she'd lost, everything she'd been trying to forget. For 7 years she'd felt like a ghost of her former self, displaced and disconnected from the identity that had once defined her. Now, at 30,000 feet surrounded by strangers, 2 fellow pilots were telling her that Phoenix still mattered. She raised her own hand slowly, returning the salute with the same precision and dignity she'd learned at the Air Force Academy 25 years earlier. The gesture felt rusty and unfamiliar, like speaking a language she hadn't used in years. But it also felt like coming home. The salute lasted only a few seconds, but its impact rippled through the cabin like a shockwave. Passengers who had been ignoring the drama suddenly understood that the woman being escorted through the aisle was someone special, someone worthy of respect they hadn't offered when she was just another passenger being moved to accommodate airline convenience. Captain Harrison watched the exchange with a mixture of pride and satisfaction. This was why he'd left the cockpit, Why he'd risk the complications and paperwork that would inevitably follow his decision to personally intervene. Some moments transcended standard operating procedures and company policies. Some moments required leaders to stand up and do what was right, regardless of the consequences. "Thank you," Sarah said to the two pilots, her voice barely audible but carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet cabin. Both Tyler and Lisa nodded respectfully and returned to their seats, but the impact of their gesture continued to resonate through the aircraft. As Captain Harrison and Sarah continued their walk toward first class, other passengers began to understand what they were witnessing. A businessman in row 15 stood up as they passed, offering a small nod of respect. A woman traveling with her teenage daughter whispered something to the girl, who looked up at Sarah with new interest and obvious admiration. An elderly man wearing a Vietnam veteran's cap caught Sarah's eye and mouthed the words, "Thank you," as she walked by. By the time they reached the first-class cabin, Jessica Torres was waiting with an expression that mixed professional embarrassment with reluctant compliance. The passenger from seat 1, a well-dressed man in his 60s, stood in the aisle beside his former seat, holding a glass of champagne and wearing an expression of curious good humor. "Captain," Jessica said to Harrison, "Mr. Whitman has graciously agreed to relocate to seat 2A. He wanted me to tell you that he considers it an honor to give up his seat for a military hero." Mr. Whitman extended his hand to Sarah with a warm smile. "Ma'am, the flight attendant told me a little about your background. My father served in Korea, and he taught me to recognize the debt we owe to people like you. Please take my seat with my compliments and my gratitude." Sarah shook his hand, still struggling to process the rapid transformation in her circumstances. 2 hours ago, she'd been an anonymous passenger fighting motion sickness in a cramped middle seat, dismissed and forgotten by airline staff who saw her as nothing more than a problem to be managed. Now she was being honored by fellow pilots, recognized by passengers, and personally escorted to first class by the aircraft captain. The irony wasn't lost on her. For 7 years she'd worked to blend into civilian life, to leave Phoenix behind and become just another ordinary person with an ordinary job and ordinary concerns. She'd convinced herself that her military service was irrelevant history, that the woman who had once flown combat missions over Afghanistan no longer existed. But now, surrounded by the respect and recognition of strangers, she was beginning to remember who she really was. Captain Harrison waited until Sarah was settled in her new seat before speaking again. "Captain Mitchell," he said formally, on behalf of American Eagle Airlines, and as a fellow veteran, "I want to apologize for the treatment you received today. What happened was unacceptable, and I'm going to personally ensure that it doesn't happen again." He paused, glancing around the first class cabin where other passengers were obviously listening to his words. Sometimes we get so focused on policies and procedures that we forget about the people we're serving. You reminded us today that some passengers deserve special recognition, not because they demand it, but because they've earned it through service and sacrifice. Sarah felt tears threatening again, but this time they carried relief rather than frustration. "Thank you, Captain," she said quietly. "This means more than you know." Captain Harrison nodded and turned to leave, but Jessica Torres approached him before he could return to the cockpit. "Captain," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion, "I need to apologize. I didn't understand who Captain Mitchell was when I moved her seat. If I had known about her service record and her medical condition, I would have handled the situation differently." Captain Harrison studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Torres, the problem isn't that you didn't know Captain Mitchell's background. The problem is that you didn't treat her with the respect and consideration that every passenger deserves, regardless of their history. Military service shouldn't be a requirement for basic human dignity." He softened his tone slightly, recognizing that Jessica was genuinely remorseful about her handling of the situation. However, I appreciate your willingness to acknowledge the mistake. When we land, I want you to write a detailed incident report about what happened and what you learned from it. Use it as a training opportunity for other crew members." Jessica nodded gratefully, understanding that Captain Harrison was offering her a chance to learn and grow rather than simply face disciplinary action. "Yes, sir. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." As Jessica returned to her duties and Captain Harrison headed back to the cockpit, Sarah settled into her first-class seat and tried to process everything that had happened. The leather was soft and supportive, the legroom generous, and most importantly, the forward position in the aircraft meant that her inner ear was no longer being assaulted by the motion that had made the flight unbearable. But the physical comfort was secondary to the emotional impact of the last 30 minutes. The recognition from Tyler and Lisa, the respect from Captain Harrison, the gracious gesture from Mr. Whitman, even Jessica's eventual acknowledgement of her mistake all combined to create a feeling Sarah hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since her medical retirement from the Air Force, she felt seen and valued for who she really was rather than dismissed as just another aging passenger with complaints and medical issues. She pulled out her phone and stared at the screen for a long moment before opening her text messages. Her son Jake had sent her a message that morning, wishing her luck with the flight and reminding her to call when she landed. She'd planned to send him a brief response confirming her safe arrival, but now she found herself wanting to share what had happened, to tell him about the pilots who had recognized her service and the captain who had stood up for what was right. Instead, she closed the phone and reached into her carry-on bag, pulling out the sealed envelope Jake had given her 2 months earlier. The letter he'd written for when she was ready to remember who she really was. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal and unfolded the handwritten pages. Jake's familiar scrawl filling 3 sheets of notebook paper. "Mom," the letter began, "I know you don't like talking about your time in the Air Force, and I understand why. I've watched you struggle with the memories and the pain and the feeling that nobody understands what you went through. But I want you to know that I've never stopped being proud of who you were and who you are." Sarah's vision blurred as she continued reading. Jake wrote about growing up with a mother who was a hero, about the pride he felt when he told his friends that his mom had been a fighter pilot, about his determination to follow in her footsteps. Despite her concerns about the dangers and sacrifices involved in military service, "You taught me that some things are worth fighting for, even when the cost is high," Jake had written. "You showed me what courage looks like, what integrity means, what it means to serve something bigger than yourself. The woman who flew those missions over Afghanistan is the same woman who taught me to ride a bike and helped me with my homework and held me when I was scared. You didn't stop being Phoenix when you left the Air Force. Phoenix is part of who you are, and she always will be." The letter concluded with a promise that made Sarah's heart ache with love and worry in equal measure. "When I graduate from the academy and earn my wings, I want you to pin them on my uniform. Not because you're my mother, but because you're the pilot I most want to become. Phoenix taught me to fly before I ever left the ground, and I'm ready to soar." Sarah folded the letter carefully and held it against her chest, overwhelmed by the convergence of recognition and love that had filled the last hour of her life. Jake's words, combined with the respect shown by Tyler and Lisa and the intervention of Captain Harrison, created a perfect storm of emotional validation that forced her to confront the truth she'd been avoiding for 7 years. She was still Phoenix. The call sign wasn't just a relic of her military past. It was part of her identity, part of who she was at her core. The woman who had risen from the ashes of combat trauma and career-ending injury was the same woman who had protected convoys and saved lives and earned the respect of fellow warriors. Leaving the Air Force hadn't erased those achievements or that identity. It had simply relocated them to a different context. For the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to remember the good parts of her military service. The camaraderie of her squadron, the satisfaction of successful missions, the pride of wearing the uniform and serving her country. She'd spent so long focusing on what she'd lost that she'd forgotten what she'd gained, the experiences and relationships, and sense of purpose that had shaped her into the woman she'd become. The aircraft hit a patch of turbulence, a gentle rocking motion that would have sent her stomach into revolt if she'd still been in seat 28B, but here in first class, properly positioned and surrounded by respect rather than indifference, the motion felt like the kind of gentle movement she'd once loved during peaceful flights over friendly territory. Sarah closed her eyes and allowed herself to remember what it felt like to fly, to be part of something larger than herself, to know that her skills and courage and dedication mattered in ways that extended far beyond her individual concerns. Tomorrow she would stand before her peers and accept recognition for her service, but today she'd received something even more valuable. She'd received confirmation that Phoenix still mattered, that her sacrifices hadn't been forgotten, that the woman she'd been in the cockpit of an F-16 was still worthy of respect and recognition. The transformation wasn't complete yet. She still had to face the ceremony, still had to find a way to reconcile her military past with her civilian present, still had to figure out how to be both Sarah, Mitchell, and Phoenix in a world that didn't always appreciate the complexities of veteran identity. But for now, sitting in first class at 35,000 feet, surrounded by the respect of fellow travelers and the love contained in her son's letter, she felt ready to begin the journey back to herself. Outside the aircraft window, the landscape passed by in a blur of clouds and geography, but inside, Sarah was finally flying again. The news of what had happened in the main cabin spread through the aircraft like electricity through copper wire. Passengers who had witnessed the salute pulled out their phones, not to record or exploit the moment, but to text family members about the extraordinary scene they'd just witnessed. A decorated war hero, they typed to spouses and children, and friends, fighter pilot, combat veteran. The airline tried to hide her in the back, but the captain himself came out to make it right. In seat 7C, Margaret Hofstetter clutched her phone with trembling fingers as she composed a message to her grandson. He was a sophomore at the Air Force Academy, full of dreams about flying fighters and serving his country, and she knew he needed to hear this story. She wrote carefully, her arthritis making each letter a small struggle, but the message was too important to abbreviate. "There are still heroes among us," she typed. "I just watched 2 young pilots salute a woman who risked everything for strangers, and it reminded me why your grandfather was so proud of his uniform." 3 rows behind her, Dr. Amanda Chen watched the ripple effects of recognition spreading through the cabin and felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with professional achievement. She'd spent her career studying the psychological impact of trauma on military veterans, documenting the ways that society's indifference could compound the wounds inflicted by combat and injury. But today, she was witnessing the opposite phenomenon, the healing power of recognition and respect, the way acknowledgement could begin to restore what had been damaged by years of invisibility. Amanda had made a career of understanding the complex relationship between military identity and civilian reintegration, but she'd rarely seen the process work in reverse, watching someone reclaim their warrior identity after years of suppressing it. The woman now sitting in first class had clearly spent years learning to hide who she'd been, to minimize her service and downplay her achievements in order to fit into a civilian world that often viewed military experience as irrelevant or uncomfortable. But in the space of 30 minutes, that carefully constructed anonymity had been stripped away, revealing the decorated pilot beneath the quiet facade. The transformation was visible even from Amanda's seat several rows away. Sarah's posture had changed. Her shoulders no longer hunched defensively, but held with the unconscious pride of someone remembering their worth. The way she held her head, the set of her jaw, even the manner in which she'd folded the letter from her son, all spoke of a woman rediscovering parts of herself she'd thought were lost forever. But Amanda also recognized the emotional turbulence that accompanied such rapid identity shifts. The relief and gratitude Sarah was feeling would eventually give way to more complicated emotions as she processed what had happened and what it meant for her future. Years of psychological conditioning didn't disappear in a single moment of recognition, no matter how powerful that moment might be. The real work of integration and healing would come later, in the quiet hours when the spotlight faded and Sarah had to figure out how to carry this new sense of self back into her ordinary life. In the cockpit, Captain Harrison was dealing with his own complex emotions as he processed the events of the last hour. He'd made decisions today that went beyond standard operating procedures, choices that could potentially result in customer complaints, corporate scrutiny, and questions about his judgment from airline management. Moving a paying first-class passenger to accommodate someone whose original seat assignment had been legitimately changed according to company policy was the kind of decision that generated paperwork and meetings and carefully worded incident reports. But Harrison had learned long ago that some decisions couldn't be made based on policy manuals and customer service protocols. Leadership sometimes required taking risks, making choices that felt right even when they couldn't be easily justified. Through official channels, the woman now sitting in first class had earned the right to better treatment through 15 years of service and sacrifice, and Harrison was prepared to defend his decision to anyone who questioned it. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Commander Mike Stevens, shared Harrison's perspective and understood the potential complications better than most. Mike had been the one to pull up Sarah's service record on his personal device, scrolling through mission reports and commendation citations that painted a picture of exceptional courage and skill. The details were sometimes classified, but the broad outlines of her career were available through military databases, and what Mike had found made him understand why Harrison had felt compelled to act. Captain Sarah Mitchell, callsign Phoenix, had flown 137 combat missions over Afghanistan and Iraq. She'd been credited with destroying multiple surface-to-air missile sites, providing close air support for ground troops under fire, and conducting precision strikes against high-value targets in densely populated areas. Her final mission had involved engaging enemy fighters while providing cover for a medical evacuation helicopter, a combat action that had resulted in her aircraft being damaged by ground fire and her subsequent emergency ejection over hostile territory. The ejection had saved her life but ended her flying career. The force of the ejection seat activation had caused severe damage to her inner ear, creating the balance and motion sensitivity issues that had made her original seat assignment not just uncomfortable but genuinely necessary for her health and safety. The fact that airline staff had dismissed her medical concerns as passenger entitlement showed a fundamental misunderstanding of both her condition and her character. Mike Stevens understood the broader implications of what had happened because he'd seen similar situations during his own military career. Veterans often struggled with the transition from military to civilian life, partly because civilian society rarely understood or appreciated the sacrifices that military service required. The invisible wounds of war, whether physical like Sarah's, inner ear damage, or psychological like post-traumatic stress, were often dismissed or minimized by people who had never faced the realities of combat. But today had been different. Today, a community of recognition had formed spontaneously around one veteran, created by the intersection of coincidence and character that sometimes aligned to produce moments of unexpected grace. The F-16 pilots who had offered their salute, the captain who had intervened personally, the passenger who had given up his first-class seat, even the flight attendant who had eventually recognized her mistake had all contributed to a moment of collective acknowledgement that transcended individual actions. As the aircraft continued its eastward journey toward Washington, the atmosphere in the cabin had settled into something approaching reverence. Conversations were quieter, more thoughtful, as passengers processed what they'd witnessed and considered its implications for their own understanding of service and sacrifice. Several people had approached the flight attendants to ask about Sarah's background, not from curiosity, but from a genuine desire to understand the significance of what they'd seen. Jessica Torres found herself in the unusual position of having to explain a passenger's military service record to other travelers. A conversation she was completely unprepared for, but felt compelled to handle with appropriate dignity. She'd spent the last hour researching Sarah's background on her personal device, reading through news articles and military publications that documented Phoenix's career and achievements. The more she learned, the more ashamed she felt about her initial handling of the situation. Jessica had joined the airline industry straight out of college, trained in customer service protocols and company policies, but never educated about the specific needs and backgrounds of military passengers. Her assumption that Sarah's medical claims were exaggerated or fabricated reflected her own inexperience rather than any malicious intent, but the impact had been the same regardless of motivation. She'd treated a decorated combat veteran as a problem to be managed rather than a customer deserving of respect and accommodation. The incident had become a learning opportunity, but Jessica understood that her education had come at Sarah's expense. The humiliation and discomfort Sarah had endured in seat 28B couldn't be undone by subsequent recognition and upgrade. Memory of being dismissed and disbelieved would remain part of Sarah's travel experience, a reminder of how quickly respect could be withdrawn and dignity could be damaged by institutional indifference. But Jessica had also witnessed the power of correction and acknowledgement. Captain Harrison's intervention hadn't just solved a seating problem. It had restored Sarah's sense of worth and belonging in a way that would have lasting impact. Salute from the F-16 pilots hadn't just been a gesture of respect. It had been a public declaration that Sarah's service mattered and her sacrifices were remembered. These acts of recognition couldn't erase the initial injustice, but they could transform its meaning and impact. In first class, Sarah was experiencing her own complex emotional journey as she processed the rapid changes in her circumstances and status. The physical comfort of her new seat was significant, but the psychological impact of the recognition she'd received was far more profound. For 7 years, she'd lived with the assumption that her military identity was irrelevant. Baggage, something to be downplayed or hidden in order to fit into civilian society. The events of the last hour had challenged that assumption in ways that would require months or years to fully understand. The letter from her son Jake remained in her hands, its pages soft from repeated folding and unfolding as she read and reread his words. His perspective on her identity and service provided a counterpoint to her own self-doubt and minimization. Where she saw failure and loss, he saw heroism and sacrifice. Where she saw irrelevant history, he saw ongoing inspiration. The disconnect between their perspectives revealed how thoroughly she'd internalized society's indifference to her military experience. Jake's letter also forced her to confront the ways her own discomfort with recognition had affected their relationship. She'd spent years deflecting his questions about her service, changing the subject when he expressed interest in her military career, and discouraging his plans to follow in her footsteps. Her motivations had been protective, driven by love and concern for his safety and well-being, but the effect had been to deny him access to an important part of his own heritage and identity. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd spent years trying to protect Jake from the dangers and disappointments of military service while simultaneously feeling diminished by the loss of her own military identity. She'd wanted him to choose a safer, easier path while mourning the absence of purpose and meaning that had defined her own military years. The contradiction revealed the complexity of veteran identity, and the contradiction revealed the complexity of veteran identity, and the complexity of veteran identity, and the challenges of transitioning from a life of service to civilian. Pursuits that often felt less significant by comparison. Sarah's meditation on these themes was interrupted by a gentle touch on her shoulder. She looked up to find Margaret Hofstetter, the elderly woman from row 7, standing beside her seat with an expression of nervous determination. The woman appeared to be in her 80s, well-dressed but frail, and she clutched her phone with hands that shook slightly from age or emotion. "Excuse me, dear," Margaret said, her voice soft but clear. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I wanted to thank you for your service. My husband was Army Air Corps in World War II, and my grandson is at the Air Force Academy now. When I saw those young men salute you, it reminded me of why we're all so proud of people like you." Sarah felt the familiar discomfort that always accompanied such expressions of gratitude, the sense that she didn't deserve recognition for simply doing her job, for following orders and serving her country in the ways she'd been trained to do. But Margaret's words carried a weight that transcended routine politeness, connecting Sarah's service to a broader tradition of military sacrifice that extended across generations. "Thank you," Sarah replied, uncertain how to respond to such heartfelt appreciation. "That means a great deal coming from a military family." Margaret smiled and held up her phone, showing Sarah a text message she'd composed, but not yet sent. "I was writing to my grandson about what I witnessed today. He's been struggling with some of his classes, feeling discouraged about whether he's cut out for military service. I think he needs to hear about what real courage looks like." Sarah read the message Margaret had written, a description of the salute and recognition that painted her in terms she barely recognized. Hero, Margaret had called her, role model, example of the best values of military service. The words felt foreign and uncomfortable, but they also carried a truth she'd been avoiding for years. "You should send that message," Sarah said quietly. "Your grandson is lucky to have someone who understands the importance of service and sacrifice." Margaret nodded and tapped the send button, then looked back at Sarah with an expression that mixed gratitude with concern. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but are you traveling to Washington for something special? You seem like someone who should be receiving recognition for your contributions." Sarah hesitated, still uncomfortable with discussing her achievements or the ceremony that awaited her in Washington. The Lifetime Achievement Award felt like something that belonged to Phoenix, the confident pilot who had once commanded respect through skill and courage. Sarah the civilian, Sarah the flight instructor, Sarah the struggling single mother didn't feel worthy of such recognition. "I'm receiving an award from the Air Force Association," she finally admitted, "for my service record and contributions to military aviation." Margaret's face lit up with genuine joy and pride. "How wonderful. Your grandson must be so proud of you." "Actually," Sarah said, thinking of Jake's letter and his determination to follow her path despite her reservations, "he's the one who convinced me to accept the award. He's been more proud of my service than I have been." The conversation continued for several more minutes, Margaret sharing stories about her husband's wartime service and her grandson's academy experience, while Sarah found herself opening up about her own military background in ways she hadn't done in years. The exchange felt healing in ways she couldn't quite articulate, a reminder that her service was part of a larger tapestry of military tradition that connected families and generations across decades of American history. After Margaret returned to her seat, Sarah found herself reflecting on the unexpected connections that had emerged during this flight. The F-16 pilots who had recognized her service, Captain Harrison who had intervened on her behalf, the passenger who had given up his seat, even Margaret who had sought her out to express gratitude, all represented different aspects of a community she'd forgotten she belonged to. Military service created bonds that transcended rank and branch and generation, connections that could remain dormant for years but could be activated by recognition and shared experience. The realization forced her to reconsider her approach to Jake's military aspirations. She'd been so focused on protecting him from the dangers and disappointments she'd experience that she'd ignored the benefits and connections that military service could provide. The community of respect and recognition she was experiencing today was something Jake deserved to understand and appreciate, even if he ultimately chose a different path. Sarah pulled out her phone and began composing a text message to Jake, something she'd never done mid-flight but felt compelled to do now. The words came slowly at first, then with increasing confidence as she found language to describe what had happened and what it meant. "Jake," she wrote, "something extraordinary happened on my flight today. 2 F-16 pilots recognized my call sign and saluted me in front of the entire cabin. The captain personally moved me to first class and apologized for how I'd been treated. An elderly woman thanked me for my service and told me about her grandson at the academy. For the first time in 7 years, I felt like Phoenix again. I'm starting to understand what you've been trying to tell me about pride and identity and the importance of remembering who we are. We need to talk when I get home. I think it's time I stopped running from my past and started embracing it. I love you, and I'm proud that you want to follow this path, even though it scares me." She read the message twice before sending it, checking for the kind of emotional vulnerability that had made her uncomfortable for years, but now felt necessary and appropriate. The response came back within minutes. A series of heart emojis followed, by a single sentence that made her eyes fill with tears. "I knew Phoenix was still in there somewhere. Welcome back, Mom." The exchange with Jake marked another turning point in Sarah's emotional journey, the moment when recognition from strangers began to translate into acceptance of her own identity and worth. The external validation she'd received during the flight was important, but the internal integration of that recognition was where real healing would occur. She was beginning to understand that Phoenix and Sarah weren't separate identities competing for dominance, but different aspects of the same person who had always been worthy of respect and recognition. As the aircraft began its descent toward Washington, Sarah found herself looking forward to the ceremony with something approaching excitement rather than anxiety. The award she would receive tomorrow would be meaningful not because it validated her past achievements, but because it represented her willingness to embrace the fullness of her identity and experience. She was ready to be Phoenix again, not in the cockpit of an F-16, but in the fullness of her civilian life, carrying forward the values and experiences that had shaped her into the woman she'd become. The transformation wasn't complete, and Sarah understood that integrating her military and civilian identities would be an ongoing process rather than a single moment of recognition. But something fundamental had shifted during this flight, a recognition that her service and sacrifice were not burdens to be hidden, but achievements to be honored and shared. The community of respect she'd encountered today was something she could carry forward, a reminder that Phoenix had never really disappeared, but had simply been waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. Outside the aircraft window, the lights of Washington began to appear in the distance, marking the end of a journey that had been far more significant than the simple transportation from one city to another. Sarah was arriving as a different person than she'd been when the flight began, not because she'd changed, but because she'd remembered who she'd always been. Tomorrow she would accept an award for her military service, but today she'd received something far more valuable, the recognition that Phoenix was not her past but her present, not something she'd lost, but something she'd carried with her all along. The descent into Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport began with the familiar chime of the seatbelt signal and Captain Harrison's voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our initial descent into Washington National. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for arrival. But before we land, I want to share something with all of you about the journey we've taken together today." Sarah felt her stomach tighten as Harrison's voice filled the cabin. She'd hoped the recognition would remain contained to this small group of passengers who had witnessed the salute, but something in the captain's tone suggested he had broader intentions. Around her, The first-class cabin grew quiet as passengers sensed they were about to hear something significant. "Today," Harrison continued, his voice carrying the authority and gravitas that came from decades of command experience, "we had the privilege of flying with Captain Sarah Mitchell, call sign Phoenix, a decorated combat veteran of the United States Air Force. Captain Mitchell flew 137 missions over Afghanistan and Iraq, protecting American forces and civilian populations through her skill, courage, and dedication to duty." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling exposed and vulnerable as Harrison shared details of her service with the entire aircraft. She'd spent 7 years learning to blend into anonymity, and having her military record broadcast to 200 strangers felt like being stripped naked in public. But Harrison's words carried respect and admiration rather than exploitation, and she gradually realized that his announcement was intended to educate rather than embarrass. Captain Mitchell was injured in the line of duty during an emergency ejection while providing combat air support for a medical evacuation. Her injuries ended her flying career, but not her service to our nation. She currently works as a flight instructor, passing on her knowledge and experience to the next generation of aviators. Tomorrow, she will receive the Air Force Association's Lifetime Achievement Award for her contributions to military aviation and national defense. The cabin remained completely silent as Harrison's words sank in. Sarah could feel the weight of 200 people's attention focused on her location, could sense the shift in understanding as passengers realized they'd been traveling with someone whose service and sacrifice had protected their freedom and safety. The discomfort was overwhelming, but underneath it was something else, something she hadn't felt in years: pride. Earlier today, Harrison continued, "Our crew made an error in judgment regarding Captain Mitchell's seat assignment." She was moved from her medically necessary seat to an inadequate location, despite her clear explanation of her service-connected medical needs. This was unacceptable treatment of any passenger, but especially of someone who has given so much in service to our country. Sarah opened her eyes and looked around the first-class cabin, noting the expressions of the passengers who were listening to Harrison's words. She saw respect, admiration, and in some cases what appeared to be shame as people realized they had witnessed injustice without speaking up. The businessman who had initially occupied seat 1, I was looking at her with undisguised reverence, as if he was processing for the first time the significance of his gesture in giving up his seat. "I want to be clear," Harrison said, his voice carrying a tone of absolute conviction that Captain Mitchell did not request special treatment or demand recognition for her service. She simply asked to keep the seat she had booked to accommodate her medical needs. When that request was denied, she accepted the decision with grace and dignity, even when it caused her physical discomfort and distress. The announcement was having a visible impact throughout the cabin. Sarah could see passengers in the main cabin turning to look toward first class, trying to get a glimpse of the woman Harrison was describing. Some were pulling out their phones, not to record, but to text family members about the extraordinary person they were sharing their flight with. Others simply sat in respectful silence, processing the magnitude of what they were hearing. It was other passengers and crew members who recognized Captain Mitchell's true identity and ensured she received the respect and accommodation she deserved. Harrison continued. 2 active-duty F-16 pilots on this flight identified her call sign and rendered appropriate military honors. A fellow passenger voluntarily gave up his first-class seat, so Captain Mitchell could travel with the dignity befitting her service. Record. These actions represent the best of American values: recognition of service, respect for sacrifice, and the understanding that we owe our freedom to people like Captain Mitchell. Sarah felt tears beginning to form at the corners of her eyes as Harrison's words penetrated the defensive walls she'd built around her military identity. For 7 years she'd convinced herself that her service was ancient history, irrelevant to her civilian life and unworthy of recognition or respect. But Harrison was describing Phoenix as someone whose contributions mattered, whose sacrifices had meaning, whose service deserved ongoing acknowledgement and appreciation. As we prepare to land in our nation's capital, Harrison said, "I want all of us to remember that freedom isn't free. It's protected and preserved by people like Captain Mitchell, who volunteer to put themselves in harm's way so the rest of us can live in safety and security." The next time you see a veteran, whether in uniform or in civilian clothes, remember that you may be looking at someone who has paid a price for your freedom that most of us can't imagine. The intercom clicked off, leaving the cabin in profound silence. Sarah sat motionless in her seat, overwhelmed by the public recognition of her service and the understanding that Harrison had permanently changed how every person on the aircraft would remember this flight. She was no longer just another passenger. She was a living reminder of the cost of freedom and the courage of those who volunteer to pay that price. The silence was broken by the sound of applause, starting with a single pair of hands and spreading quickly throughout the aircraft. Sarah could hear it beginning in the main cabin and moving forward, gaining momentum and volume as passengers understood that they were being given an opportunity to express their gratitude and respect. The applause wasn't the polite, obligatory clapping that sometimes followed airline announcements, but the genuine, heartfelt appreciation of people who had been moved by what they'd heard. Sarah remained seated, uncertain how to respond to such public recognition. She'd received applause before, during military ceremonies and retirement events, but always in the context of her service identity, where such acknowledgement was expected and appropriate. This felt different, more personal and meaningful because it came from strangers who owed her nothing but chose to express their gratitude anyway. The applause continued for nearly 2 minutes, and Sarah gradually became aware that people throughout the aircraft were standing, turning the simple clapping into a genuine standing ovation. The businessman beside her was on his feet, clapping with obvious emotion. Margaret Hofstetter, the elderly woman who had thanked her earlier, was standing in the main cabin with tears streaming down her face. Even Jessica Torres, the flight attendant who had initially moved her from seat 12F, was applauding with what appeared to be genuine respect and remorse. Finally, Sarah understood that she needed to acknowledge the recognition being offered to her. She stood slowly, turned toward the main cabin, and offered a small wave of appreciation to the passengers who were honoring her service. The gesture seemed to energize the applause, and she could see people throughout the aircraft responding with increased enthusiasm and obvious emotional engagement. Tyler Brooks and Lisa Rodriguez, the F-16 pilots who had initiated the recognition earlier in the flight, were standing in their seats and applauding with the intensity of people who understood the significance of what they were witnessing. Their military training had taught them to honor service and sacrifice, but their personal experience as combat pilots gave them unique insight into what Sarah had endured and achieved during her military career. As the applause finally died down and passengers returned to their seats, Sarah remained standing for a moment longer, looking out over the cabin full of people who had chosen to honor her service. The experience was overwhelming and humbling. A reminder that gratitude and respect for military service still existed in American society, even when it wasn't always visible or expressed. She settled back into her seat as the aircraft continued its descent, and gradually became aware that her entire relationship with her military identity had been fundamentally altered during this flight. The shame and discomfort she'd felt about her service record had been replaced by something approaching pride and acceptance. She was beginning to understand that her reluctance to embrace her military identity had been a form of self-protection rather than appropriate humility, a way of avoiding the pain of loss and disappointment rather than a healthy integration of her experiences. The landing was smooth and routine, but for Sarah it marked the end of a journey that had been far more significant than simple transportation from Phoenix to Washington. She was arriving as a different person than she'd been when the flight began. Not because she'd changed, but because she'd rediscovered aspects of herself that had been buried under years of civilian conformity and self-doubt. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, passengers began gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. Sarah noticed that many people were looking in her direction, not with curiosity or intrusion, but with respect and appreciation. Some offered small nods or smiles of acknowledgement as they caught her eye, gestures that conveyed gratitude without demanding interaction or response. Captain Harrison emerged from the cockpit as the aircraft reached the gate, and Sarah could see him scanning the cabin until his eyes found her. He walked directly to her seat, his expression serious but warm, and extended his hand in a gesture that was both professional and personal. "Captain Mitchell," he said, using her military rank with obvious respect, "it has been an honor to have you aboard my aircraft today. I hope the remainder of your journey goes smoothly, and I want you to know that what happened earlier was completely unacceptable. I've filed a report with our customer service department, recommending policy changes to ensure better treatment of passengers with military backgrounds and medical needs." Sarah shook his hand, feeling the firm grip of someone who understood the importance of accountability and follow-through. "Thank you, Captain Harrison. Your intervention today meant more than you know. You reminded me of something I'd forgotten about dignity and respect, and the importance of standing up for what's right." Harrison nodded, then glanced around to ensure their conversation was private before continuing. "Captain, I want you to know that I looked up your service record after we spoke earlier. What you accomplished during your military career was extraordinary, and the way you handled today's situation with grace and dignity was equally impressive. You're a credit to the uniform you once wore and the civilian clothes you wear now." The conversation was interrupted by Jessica Torres, who approached with obvious nervousness and determination. "Captain Mitchell," she said, her voice tight with emotion, "I owe you a personal apology. My handling of your seat assignment was unprofessional and disrespectful, and I want you to know that I've learned from this experience. I'll be participating in additional training on military passenger needs and medical accommodation requirements." Sarah studied Jessica's face, seeing genuine remorse and commitment to improvement, rather than mere professional obligation. "We all make mistakes, Jessica. What matters is what we learn from them and how we apply that knowledge going forward. I appreciate your willingness to acknowledge what happened and your commitment to doing better in the future." Jessica nodded gratefully, understanding that Sarah was offering forgiveness rather than continued recrimination. "I want you to know that I'll never forget this experience or the lesson it taught me about treating every passenger with respect and dignity, regardless of their appearance or apparent status." As passengers began moving toward the exit, Sarah gathered her belongings and prepared to leave the aircraft. The process felt different than any deplaning experience she'd had in recent memory, with fellow passengers offering respectful greetings and expressions of gratitude as she made her way through the cabin. The interactions were brief and appropriate, but they created a sense of community and shared understanding that transformed the routine process of leaving an aircraft into something approaching a ceremonial experience. Tyler Brooks and Lisa Rodriguez were waiting near the exit, standing at informal attention as Sarah approached. "Ma'am," Tyler said, his voice carrying the respect of one professional for another, "it was an honor to share this flight with you, Captain Rodriguez, and I wanted to thank you again for your service and to wish you well at tomorrow's ceremony." Lisa stepped forward with a small business card in her hand. "Captain Mitchell, I wanted to give you my contact information. If you're ever interested in speaking to current F-16 pilots about your experiences or sharing your knowledge with the next generation of aviators, I'd be honored to help arrange something. Your perspective and expertise would be valuable to pilots who are facing the same challenges you once overcame." Sarah accepted the card, feeling a warmth and connection that she hadn't experienced with fellow pilots since her retirement from active duty. The offer represented more than professional networking. It was an invitation to remain connected to the military aviation community that had once been her professional home and personal identity. "Thank you both," Sarah said, her voice carrying genuine appreciation and emerging confidence. "Today reminded me that leaving the Air Force didn't mean leaving the aviation community. I'd be honored to share my experiences with current pilots, and I hope we can stay in touch." The exchange marked another step in Sarah's evolving relationship with her military identity, a recognition that her knowledge and experience remained valuable even outside the context of active duty service. The isolation she'd felt since her medical retirement had been partly self-imposed, a result of her assumption that civilian life required complete separation from her military background and professional relationships. As Sarah walked through the jet bridge toward the terminal, she was accompanied by Margaret Hofstetter, who had waited to walk with her despite the inconvenience of deplaning later than necessary. "Dear," Margaret said, taking Sarah's arm with gentle familiarity, "I wanted to tell you that I sent that message to my grandson, and he responded immediately. He said knowing that people like you are still serving as role models gives him confidence, that he's chosen the right path." The conversation continued as they walked through the terminal, Margaret sharing details about her grandson's academy experience while Sarah found herself offering encouragement and advice based on her own military background. The interaction felt natural and comfortable, a reminder that her military experience could be a source of guidance and inspiration for others rather than a burden to be hidden or minimized. They parted ways at the baggage claim area, but not before Margaret had extracted a promise from Sarah to stay in touch and perhaps correspond with her grandson about military aviation careers. The request felt like an honor rather than an obligation, another indication that Sarah's knowledge and experience remained relevant and valuable to people she'd never met but who shared her commitment to service and sacrifice. Sarah's luggage arrived quickly, and she made her way toward the ground transportation area, where a hotel shuttle was waiting to take her to her accommodation near the Pentagon. As she walked through the terminal, she noticed that her posture was different, her stride more confident, her bearing more in keeping with the military officer she'd once been than the retiring civilian she'd become. The shuttle ride to the hotel gave her time to process the events of the day and prepare mentally for the ceremony that awaited her tomorrow. The Lifetime Achievement Award had felt like an obligation when she'd first received the invitation, something to be endured rather than celebrated. But now it felt like an opportunity to publicly embrace the identity she'd spent years trying to suppress, a chance to stand before her peers and acknowledge that Phoenix was not her past but her present. The hotel was filled with military personnel and veterans attending the same ceremony, and Sarah found herself recognized and welcomed by people she hadn't seen in years. The interactions were warm and respectful, filled with shared memories and mutual recognition of service and sacrifice. For the first time since her retirement, Sarah felt like she belonged in a military environment, not as an outsider looking back, but as a continuing member of a community that valued her contributions and respected her ongoing presence. Her hotel room was comfortable and quiet, offering a view of the Pentagon and the monuments beyond. Sarah stood at the window, looking out at the symbols of American military power and remembering the young Air Force Academy cadet who had once dreamed of serving her country in the cockpit of a fighter aircraft. That dream had been fulfilled beyond her wildest expectations, and though it had ended with injury and disappointment, it had also provided her with experiences and relationships that would last a lifetime. She called Jake from her hotel room, sharing details about the flight and the recognition she'd received from fellow passengers and crew members. His excitement and pride were obvious, and she could hear in his voice the same enthusiasm for military service that had once driven her own career decisions. For the first time in years, She found herself encouraging rather than discouraging his military aspirations, offering advice and support based on her own experiences rather than warnings based on her fears. The conversation with Jake helped solidify the transformation she'd begun during the flight, the evolution from reluctant civilian to proud veteran who understood that her service identity remained relevant and valuable. She was ready to accept the award tomorrow not as a symbol of past achievement, but as recognition of ongoing contribution to military aviation and national defense. That evening, Sarah attended a reception for award recipients and distinguished guests where she was surrounded by active-duty military personnel, veterans, and civilian supporters of military aviation. The conversations were substantive and meaningful, filled with technical discussions about aircraft capabilities, strategic considerations about future threats, and personal reflections on the challenges and rewards of military service. For the first time in 7 years, Sarah felt intellectually and professionally engaged in ways that had been missing from her civilian career. Her experience as a combat pilot remained relevant and respected, her knowledge valued by people who understood the complexity and importance of military aviation. The isolation and irrelevance she'd felt since leaving active duty had been largely self-imposed, a result of her own reluctance to engage with military communities rather than their rejection of her contributions. The ceremony the following day was held in a Pentagon auditorium filled with military officials, aviation industry leaders, and families of award recipients. Sarah's name was called, and she walked to the podium with confidence and pride, accepting the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Chief of Staff of the Air Force with the bearing and dignity of someone who understood the significance of the recognition. Her acceptance speech was brief but heartfelt, acknowledging the support of her family, the guidance of her mentors, and the sacrifice of her fellow service members who had paid the ultimate price for freedom. She spoke about the importance of military aviation in national defense and the responsibility of veterans to share their knowledge and experience with future generations of aviators. The speech was well received, but more importantly, it represented Sarah's public re-embrace of her military identity and her commitment to remaining engaged with the aviation community that had shaped her career and character. She was no longer hiding from Phoenix. She was proudly claiming that identity and the responsibilities that came with it. After the ceremony, Sarah was approached by numerous attendees who wanted to discuss her service record, share their own military experiences, or explore opportunities for continued engagement with military aviation education and training. The conversations were energizing and inspiring, filled with possibilities for meaningful contribution that would allow her to remain connected to her military roots while pursuing civilian opportunities. The flight home to Phoenix was uneventful, but meaningful, a return journey that marked the completion of a transformation that had begun in Seat 28B and concluded with public recognition and renewed purpose. Sarah was returning as a different person than she'd been when she left, not because she'd changed, but because she'd remembered who she'd always been and accepted the fullness of her identity and experience. Jake was waiting for her at the airport, wearing his ROTC uniform and carrying himself with the pride and confidence of someone preparing for military service. The sight of him in uniform filled Sarah with emotions she'd thought she'd lost forever: pride in service, confidence in the future, and hope that the values and traditions she'd embodied during her own military career would continue through the next generation. Their embrace at the airport was captured by a local news photographer who had learned about Sarah's award and wanted to document her homecoming. The photo would later appear in the city newspaper with a caption identifying her as a local hero and role model. But for Sarah, the moment was simply about the love and respect shared between a mother and son who understood the importance of service and sacrifice. The drive home from the airport gave them time to talk about the ceremony, the award, and Sarah's evolving perspective on her military identity and civilian future. Jake listened with obvious interest and pride as she described the recognition she'd received and the opportunities for continued engagement with military aviation that had emerged from the experience. Most importantly, they talked about his own military aspirations and her changing attitude toward his plans for Air Force Academy attendance and pilot training. For the first time in years, Sarah found herself offering encouragement rather than caution, sharing insights and advice based on her own experiences rather than warnings based on her fears. The conversation marked the final stage of Sarah's transformation from reluctant civilian to proud veteran who understood that her service identity was not a burden to be hidden but a gift to be shared. She was ready to support Jake's military aspirations with enthusiasm rather than anxiety, confident that the values and traditions that had shaped her own character would serve him well in his own journey of service and sacrifice. Back at home, Sarah unpacked her suitcase and carefully placed the Lifetime Achievement Award on her desk beside the folded American flag she'd received at her retirement ceremony 7 years earlier. The juxtaposition of the two items represented the integration of her military past and civilian present, a recognition that Phoenix and Sarah were not competing identities, but complementary aspects of the same person. She also placed Tyler Brooks and Lisa Rodriguez's business cards beside the award, symbols of her renewed connection to the military aviation community and her commitment to sharing her knowledge and experience with current and future pilots. The isolation and irrelevance she'd felt since leaving active duty had been replaced by a sense of ongoing purpose and contribution that would sustain her in the years ahead. That evening, Sarah sat on her back porch watching the Arizona sunset and reflecting on the journey that had brought her from Seat 28B to this moment of acceptance and integration. The recognition she'd received during the flight and ceremony had been meaningful, but the real transformation had been internal. The decision to stop hiding from Phoenix and start embracing the fullness of her identity and experience. She thought about the passengers who had witnessed her recognition on the flight, wondering if the experience had changed their understanding of military service and the veterans who lived among them. She hoped that Captain Harrison's announcement had educated them about the ongoing presence of heroes in everyday life and the importance of recognizing service and sacrifice wherever they encountered it. Most of all, she thought about Jake and the future that awaited him in military service. She was no longer afraid of the dangers and disappointments he might face, but confident that the values and character that service would develop in him would serve him well throughout his life. Phoenix had taught her that some things were worth the risk, that service and sacrifice had meaning that transcended individual concerns, and that the bonds formed in military service could sustain people through the most difficult challenges life could present. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded Sarah of the sunsets she'd watched from the cockpit of her F-16 during training flights over the Arizona desert. She was home, but more importantly, she was whole, ready to embrace the future with the confidence and purpose that came from accepting the fullness of her identity and experience. Sarah Mitchell was no longer running from Phoenix. She was Phoenix, proud and confident and ready to soar once again, not in the cockpit of a fighter aircraft, but in the fullness of life lived with purpose and meaning. The journey was just beginning. 3 months after the flight that changed everything, Sarah Mitchell stood before 12 active-duty Air Force pilots at Desert Wing's Flight Academy. The invitation to teach this specialized combat training course had come directly from the Pentagon, a result of the viral video of Captain Harrison's announcement that had been viewed by millions worldwide. Sarah discussed advanced air-to-ground tactics and threat assessment, but what made her teaching valuable wasn't just technical knowledge. She conveyed the mental and emotional aspects of combat aviation that couldn't be learned from textbooks, speaking from experience about split-second decisions that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. During A break. A young pilot approached her nervously. "Ma'am," he said formally, "I wanted to thank you for sharing your experiences. I'm deploying to the Middle East next month, and your insights about threat recognition could literally save my life." "Remember that courage isn't the absence of fear," Sarah told him. "It's the ability to function effectively despite being afraid." Every combat pilot has felt fear, but successful ones learn to use that fear as a tool for heightened awareness, rather than allowing it to paralyze them. After the session, Sarah found Jake examining a training aircraft, wearing his Air Force Academy prep school uniform. The sight of her son in uniform still produced complicated emotions, but her concerns were now balanced by confidence in his character and her renewed understanding that military service provided opportunities for personal growth difficult to find elsewhere. Tyler Brooks arrived, the F-16 pilot who had first recognized Sarah's call sign during that transformative flight. He'd maintained regular contact and become an unofficial liaison between her civilian position and the active duty aviation community. "Captain Mitchell," Tyler said, using her preferred military rank in professional settings, "today's training feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. The pilot specifically mentioned your discussions about threat assessment as particularly valuable for their deployment preparations." Tyler's report confirmed that Sarah's knowledge remained relevant to current military operations. The isolation she'd felt during retirement had been replaced by ongoing contribution and professional engagement that provided meaning and purpose. Tyler handed Sarah a formal envelope with Pentagon letterhead. This arrived through official channels. "Yesterday, I was asked to deliver it personally." Inside was a letter signed by the Secretary of the Air Force, offering her a civilian contractor position providing specialized training to active duty units. The offer included worldwide travel, significant compensation, and direct work with combat pilots preparing for deployment. The letter represented more than a job opportunity. It was official recognition that her knowledge was valuable enough to justify a formal consulting relationship with the Air Force. The position would allow her to remain connected to military aviation while maintaining civilian status. Jake Reed. Over her shoulder, excitement obvious. "Mom, this is incredible. You'd be working directly with the Air Force again. It's like Phoenix is being officially recalled to active duty in a different capacity." Sarah carefully considered the implications. The travel requirements would be significant, requiring renewed security clearances and professional certifications. The responsibilities would be substantial, with direct impact on military personnel facing real combat threats. But the opportunity represented the culmination of her transformation over the past 3 months. She would be officially recognized as a subject matter expert whose knowledge could contribute to national defense while maintaining civilian flexibility. Tyler shared news about the broader impact of Sarah's recognition. Military recruiting. Stations had reported increased interest from young people inspired by her story, and veterans organizations had requested her participation in speaking events encouraging other retired military personnel to remain engaged. The ripple effects of that single flight continued expanding. What began as humiliation in Seat 28B had evolved into a platform for encouraging military service and demonstrating the ongoing value of military experience in civilian society. Later, Sarah received a call from Margaret Hofstetter, the elderly woman who had approached her during the flight. Margaret's grandson had successfully completed his first year at the Air Force Academy, crediting Sarah's encouragement with helping him navigate military education challenges. "Sarah, dear," Margaret said warmly, "my grandson David received an award for academic excellence this semester and specifically asked me to thank you for the guidance you've provided through our correspondence." After the call, Sarah composed her acceptance letter for the Air Force consulting position. The decision felt natural and inevitable, the logical next step in her journey from reluctant retiree to engaged veteran professional. That evening, she shared the news with Jake over dinner. His excitement was infectious, his pride in her continuing service evident in his questions about the opportunities and challenges the position would provide. Their conversation addressed how Sarah's new position would complement Jake's military aspirations. Her continued connection to active duty operations would provide him with insights and context that could enhance his career development. Over the following weeks, Sarah completed security clearance renewal and began preparing for her first assignment at Nellis Air Force Base. The process felt both familiar and strange, like returning to a changed but recognizable hometown. Her first assignment involved F-16 pilots preparing for Eastern European deployment as part of NATO operations. The pilots needed specialized guidance on operating against sophisticated air defense systems, exactly the knowledge Sarah had developed. During her combat deployments, the intensive week-long training required Sarah to draw on decades of experience providing practical advice about threat recognition, tactical decision-making, and emergency procedures. The pilots responded with obvious respect. Understanding her guidance could determine their survival during deployment. On the final day, the squadron commander approached her with genuine gratitude. "Ma'am," he said formally, "this training has been the most valuable preparation we've received. Your insights about threat assessment have already changed how we approach mission planning and execution." The commander's feedback represented professional acknowledgement that Sarah's knowledge remained current and valuable despite her civilian years. The recognition felt profoundly satisfying, confirmation that Phoenix's expertise could still contribute to military effectiveness. Sarah returned to Phoenix with renewed purpose and professional satisfaction. Jake met her at the airport in his Academy cadet uniform, carrying himself with confidence, suggesting a promising military career ahead. At home, Sarah found correspondence from military personnel who had seen Captain Harrison's viral announcement and wanted to express gratitude. One letter particularly caught her attention from a female Air Force pilot in Afghanistan who credited Sarah's example with helping her persevere through combat deployment challenges and gender discrimination. The letter reminded Sarah that her visibility carried responsibilities beyond professional duties. She had become a symbol and inspiration for military women facing similar challenges, adding another dimension to her sense of purpose. That weekend, Sarah and Jake attended an air show where Tyler performed with the F-16 demonstration team. During the show, Tyler included a special announcement recognizing Sarah's presence and contributions to military aviation training, generating applause and creating opportunities to meet other attendees. She had a particularly meaningful conversation with retired General Patricia Williams, one of the first female fighter pilots in Air Force history, whose career had provided a template for women like Sarah. "Sarah," General Williams said with authority and warmth, "I'm proud of how you've handled your transition from active duty to civilian life and back to military engagement. Your example demonstrates that military careers don't end with retirement. They evolve into different forms of service and contribution." As the air show concluded, Sarah reflected on the remarkable transformation since that flight from Phoenix to Washington. The woman reluctantly moved from Seat 12F had evolved into a confident consultant whose expertise was valued by the Air Force and whose example inspired military personnel worldwide. The journey had required confronting years of self-doubt while rediscovering the confidence that had defined her military career. But the process had ultimately been healing and empowering, restoring her sense of purpose and connection to the military community. Jake's presence throughout this transformation had been particularly meaningful, providing motivation for Sarah's personal growth and validation of her decision to embrace rather than hide from her military identity. That evening, Sarah sat in her backyard looking at the stars, thinking about the pilots she'd trained, letters she'd received, and young people inspired by her example. The impact extended far beyond her individual career, creating ripples of influence that would continue long after her contributions ended. She thought about Captain Harrison, whose intervention had catalyzed her transformation and whose leadership example had inspired millions through the viral video. She thought about Tyler and Lisa, whose recognition had sparked her professional resurrection. Most of all, she thought about the unknown passengers on Flight AE 1847 who had applauded her service, people whose names she'd never know but whose respect had helped her rediscover her worth. Their spontaneous recognition had been a gift she hadn't known she needed. The stars reminded her of countless nights in military aircraft, navigating by celestial reference points while conducting missions that had protected American interests and saved lives. Those experiences remained part of who she was, integrated, now with civilian life in ways that enhanced rather than complicated her identity. Sarah Mitchell was no longer hiding from Phoenix or struggling to reconcile her military past with her civilian present. She was fully integrated, professionally engaged, and personally fulfilled, ready to continue serving her country and inspiring others through her example of resilience, courage, and commitment to excellence. The transformation was complete, but the journey was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.